post-Civil War attempts at a new constitution. The Civil War, and especially the adoption of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, rendered the Kentucky Constitution of 1850 with its provisions protecting slave property and discriminating against free blacks, obsolete. In addition, there were many other prevailing reasons for constitutional revision. Governor Stevenson, in December 1867, recommended that the legislature submit the convention question to a vote of the people. The 1850 Constitution had provided that the only way a constitutional convention could be held was through a proposal by the General Assembly approved by a majority of the voters voting in the last general election for 2 successive elections. The call for a convention was defeated on December 18, 1873, and again every 2 years through 1885, perhaps establishing a pattern for Kentucky voters of reluctance to change their constitution in its entirety. Finally, the General Assembly, under the authority of the Constitution to provide for ascertaining the number of citizens entitled to vote, called for a registration of all eligible voters to be conducted at the next election. Following this registration in the 1887 election, the convention received the required majority in 1888. It subsequently passed again in 1889, and in the following year delegates were elected to serve at the convention, convening on September 8, 1890. The Constitutional Convention of 1890 to 1891. Although one of the delegates, Curtis F. Burnham of Richmond, recommended that the convention eliminate or repeal all provisions concerning slavery and any other obsolete sections, re-adopt the Third Constitution, and go home, this was not to be. This time the delegates deliberated for 197 legislative days, and, after spending many hours in long debates, drafted a constitution of approximately 21,000 words, which was 60% longer than the 1850 Constitution. To understand the action of the delegates in the 1890 convention, it is necessary to review the political-economic developments in Kentucky from the Civil War to 1890. While Kentucky did not secede from the Union, there were strong sympathies for the South, both during and long after the war. It can almost be said that following the firing on Fort Sumter, Kentucky seceded from both sides, by refusing to permit troops to be drafted in the state by the Union and yet declining to officially join the Confederacy. The delegates to the 1890 convention were products of the era. Most of them were ultra-conservative and a majority were elderly. Many opposed the ratification of the war amendments and were bitter toward what they called radical Republicans and black suffrage. However, 20 years before the convention, the radical wing of the Republican Party had practically disintegrated and the Democrats ceased to fear radical control and the dangers of a large black vote. This led to the development of a Bourbon and a New South factionalism, with opposing philosophies within the Democratic Party itself. Henry Watterson, editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal, urged Kentuckians to accept black suffrage and the war amendments, to cease determining fitness for public office on the basis of service in the Confederate Army, and to support the industrial development of the state, particularly railroad development. Although a proposal to subsidize railroads by a $10 million bond issue was defeated in the General Assembly by the conservative agrarian members, the more liberal representatives did manage to get through generous tax exemptions and special privileges for railroads and other large corporations. As a result, during this era, Kentucky expanded railway mileage and encouraged large investments of Eastern capital in timber, coal, distilleries, and tobacco warehouses. Following the Civil War, tobacco had become the primary cash crop in Kentucky agriculture. Pre-war farming had been more diversified. The Panic of 1873 hit Kentucky hard. It was followed by 6 years of real economic depression with tobacco prices dropping, banks failing, many individual and business bankruptcies, and a drastic decline in land values. Kentucky farmers were opposed to the demonetization of silver and the Resumption Act, calling for the redemption of greenbacks in gold. Like their colleagues in other states, particularly in the Midwest, Kentucky farmers wanted cheap money to increase farm prices. The general discontent led to the organization of more than 1,100 local chapters of the Patrons of Husbandry, part of the Grange movement throughout the Midwest. Although the Grange-oriented groups failed to enact most of their legislative program, they did succeed in creating a State Bureau of Agriculture, in building support for Kentucky's Agricultural and Mechanical College, and in paving the way for the creation of a railroad commission, in order to limit the strength of large corporations to some extent. A measure of prosperity returned after 1884, but this was of little actual benefit to Kentucky farmers. Since 1860, the average size of farms had decreased, tobacco prices were lower, credit and marketing conditions were uncertain, land tenure was unstable, and taxes were high. Thus, conditions were ripe for further agricultural protest. Many local groups affiliated with the Wheel, an agricultural lodge or society resulting from this agricultural unrest, which in turn organized on a state basis and affiliated with the Farmers' Alliance in 1889. Reflecting the agrarian grievances, the Farmers' Alliance advocated as relief measures the free coinage of silver, a graduated income tax, antitrust legislation, uniform taxes on all property, an end to the national bank note issue, elimination of all special privilege legislation, a tariff for revenue only, state regulation of railroad rates, elimination of the school book trust, increased appropriations for the state, agricultural and mechanical college, greater authority for the Railroad Commission, regulation of tobacco warehouse charges, bank inspections, and elimination of all toll roads and bridges. At the time of the 1890 Constitutional Convention, Kentucky was still predominantly agricultural, with more than 80% of its nearly 2 million people living on farms or in small villages. Politically, two forces were struggling for control of public policy. The large corporations, particularly the railroad interests, sought every possible advantage and alliances were entered into to control prices. Privileges, particularly tax concessions, were sometimes gained by the purchase of votes of members of the General Assembly or their political henchmen. Utility franchises were the subject of political abuse and the railroads freely handed out passes and other political favors in return for support. As a result, railroad and other utility property frequently escaped taxation on the basis that their property was devoted to the public interest. So the railroads were highly profitable at a time when the farmers and small business interests in all the states were victims of depression. Many cities and towns were prevailed upon to go into debt to finance railroads, industries, and other business ventures, which subsequently created deplorable financial conditions for them. The voters generally believed that big business was taking over control of their government. This sentiment was not peculiar to Kentucky and was, in fact, responsible for pressuring Congress to enact the Interstate Commerce and the Sherman Antitrust Acts. Thus, we see that when the 100 delegates to the Constitutional Convention were assembled on a hot day in early September in 1890 in the old Capitol building in Frankfort, they were absorbed with the power that big corporation lobbies had exercised in shaping policy through the General Assembly. Most of the delegates believed that the most important responsibility before them was to limit the nearly unrestrained power of the legislative branch and impose checks upon it that would benefit the citizenship. The delegates were also determined to put shackles on the influence of railroads and other large corporations. What kind of people were the delegates to this convention? All of the 100 delegates were men, 60 were lawyers, 20 were farmers, 13 were physicians, and 7 were businessmen. The vast majority were of middle age or older. Many of them were politicians whose partisanship was reflected in the new Constitution. All of them wanted to speak, which helps to account for the length of the convention and its 6,480 pages of proceedings. Debate on the Bill of Rights alone consumed more than a month, even though the final draft resulted in very few changes. Upon the conclusion of the long convention, a lengthy document of 272 sections under 22 separate headings had been produced. The document contained an enormous amount of detail.
The Constitution of 1891. The present Constitution, then, was twice as long as its predecessor, and 4 times the length of the first Constitution of Kentucky. It has been pointed out that constitutions should be brief, broad, general documents confined to fundamentals, that leave much of the specific details to the legislative branch of the government. However, because of their mistrust of the General Assembly, the agrarian delegates in 1891 did not want to leave much room for inference. For the first time in Kentucky, the Constitution required a referendum by the people for adoption. Although there was some opposition to the new revision from both the citizens and the press, such opposition was mainly confined to certain parts and not to the whole. In fact, there was more criticism of the extended time spent in its drafting than of the document itself. The popular vote on August 3, 1891 was overwhelmingly for ratification, 219,914 to 74,523. Following the election vote and ratification, the convention reconvened to make changes, polish the wording, and remove ambiguities. This work was completed by September 28. However, it only resulted in reducing the number of sections from 272 to 263. The only substantive changes made during these weeks of final revision were that certain elected public officials, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, the Auditor, and the Clerk of the Court of Appeals, might not succeed themselves. The Railroad Commission was made elective rather than appointive, and a section was added requiring the General Assembly to provide for local option elections regarding the sale of alcoholic beverages. These changes were never submitted to the voters, but when this omission was tested in the Court of Appeals, the court of last resort at that time, it held that the convention had not exceeded its authority and that to invalidate its action would bring confusion and anarchy upon the state. This validity was established in the case of Miller v. Johnson in 1892, and was only the beginning of a long series of court interpretations of the 1891 Constitution. Most of the various restrictions in the present Constitution can be explained by studying the times and the sentiment of the people during the period in which they were written. One good example is the restriction of sheriffs and state officials to a single 4-year term, without power to succeed themselves. This provision probably resulted from the graft of the state treasurer, James W. Tate, known as Honest Dick Tate, who left the state in 1888 during his 9th term of office with all the money from the state treasury, $247,028.50. The limiting of annual salaries of public officials to $5,000 possibly resulted from the knowledge that officials in a few counties had pocketed as much as $30,000 in fees. Even more important, $5,000 in 1891 was considered an adequate and ample salary. The $500,000 ceiling on state indebtedness, without requiring a vote of the people, was not unreasonable at that time, because money was scarce and the state's credit had been damaged by Honest Dick's departure. Regardless of the reasons motivating the delegates, they seemed determined to protect the electorate from public officials who might yield to the temptation to waste the taxpayers' money in the future. They also wished to prevent individual officeholders in key positions from becoming powerful fixtures in the governmental process. The resulting constitutional restrictions made it difficult, however, for future governors to attract competent and qualified people with salaries below those paid for comparable positions in other states, the federal government, or private industry. History also indicates that later attempts to remove or modify these restrictions usually failed. Some liberalization has been achieved, however, through judicial interpretation of certain constitutional sections and subsequent amendments. Needless to say, after more than 100 years of intermittent litigation and changes in the interpretations of certain sections, some provisions of this document remain obscure to the citizens and require further adjudication. To understand these developments, a student of the Constitution must analyze not only the provisions of the current Kentucky Constitution, but also the practical application of that document through statutes, court decisions, and the administrative regulations of the various government agencies responsible for its interpretation and enforcement.
Thank you for viewing this history of the Kentucky Constitution. For more information, please see the following references. Citizen's Guide to the Kentucky Constitution by the Legislative Research Commission, available online. Or the book, The Kentucky State Constitution, by Robert M. Ireland, Oxford University Press.